Good evening, everyone. I think we can start with our webinar this evening. So thank you for joining us. Thank you for joining Dawra Madwarna. This is the second webinar for this year, episode 2.2. So we intend to keep up the series of webinars, which we started back during COVID times. And we found that they're a really good platform for bringing professionals together, listening to your questions, and then really they're a very good source of data. We go back to them time and time again to see what everyone said and what, to see what data we can glean from them. So yes, please do use them as a resource. They're all on our website, and you're very welcome to use the data there, get in touch with the people whom we featured, and just make sure that they're of use. So the webinar this evening is planning and designing for mental health. It's one that we've been looking forward to very much. It's very much something that we speak about at Dawra Madwarna, and we're very excited to have three lovely people with us this evening. So just in order of how they are showing up on my Zoom screen, we have Dr. Odette Lewis, a friend and colleague, Alexia, Mercieca, another friend and colleague, and Dr. Nigel Camilleri today with us, who has joined us to speak specifically about mental health and how this plays out in the built environment. So why are we speaking about this topic? I think, as I said, an extremely important topic. We at Dawra Madwarna, we speak very much about networks of green open space and how urban design and planning can contribute to better networks of green open space. And there has been a very strong link of these kind of spaces with mental health. So access to nature, the ability to exercise, having the active space, having pro-social spaces, promoting social interaction, safety, sleep, transport, the list goes on and on. I don't think there's any topic really that is excluded when we speak of mental health and urban design and planning. So I'd like to start off this hour or so that we're going to spend together, because then we will open the floor for questions. I'm already seeing a few familiar faces in my participant bar, so welcome and thank you for joining once again. Let us start off with a round of introductions, and I'm going to ask our panelists to introduce themselves. So shall we start with Odette, please? Can you say a few words about the work that you do and how you feel this relates to mental health, please?
Yes, good evening to all. Nice to be here. Thanks to Dawra Madwarna for inviting me over. So basically, I'm a civil engineer by profession. I've been working in this area for the past 20 years. I am an academic mainly at the University of Malta, but I've also worked in the public and private sector, and I do still also work in the private sector. I'm the director of the company Crowdnet, whereby we deal with the design of open spaces and mobility infrastructure. So one might say, what does the design of street infrastructure, open spaces, etc., has to do with mental health? And basically, apart from the life experience that maybe each one of us goes through and starts to realize the importance of considering these aspects in the design. Obviously, there are specific aspects linked to mobility, specific aspects linked to, for example, issues of noise pollution, the stressors out there, the safety when walking, etc. So I'll stop there with my introduction, and these things we can expand more when we're dealing with the questions that we'll be dealing with throughout this event this evening.
Thanks, Odette. Alexia?
Hi, everyone. Good evening. I'm Alexia, and thank you to Dawra Madwarna for the invitation. I'm an architect too, and an academic by profession. I've always been interested in the area of mental health. In fact, I've just defended a PhD on the effects of the immediate environment on people with dementia. I'm interested in people with dementia as the extreme case scenario of how we respond to our immediate surroundings, because as a population, they are at the extreme end of mental health needs. And my argument is that if we can design well for a person with dementia, then we're pretty much designing a better space for everyone's mental health. I think it's worth stressing that designing for mental health isn't just for people who have any diagnosis or a mental health problem, but for absolutely everyone. So I'm kind of an advocate for let us support our mental health in general by improving the way our spaces respond to our needs. And besides lecturing in this field and working in this field at university, I also work in private practice, again, generally with NGOs, sadly, in a way, because they are generally more interested in improving the field of mental health for their users, because again, the users who generally have a mental health diagnosis, but I would like to see it expanding more and to place more importance on the fact that we all have to safeguard our mental health, and design and architecture is a very important first step towards that improvement.
Definitely, we'll speak more about that. Nigel, please.
Hey, so good evening. Thank you for the invite. I'm from a slightly different field. I'm a clinical academic in child and adolescent psychiatry, and I'm also a sports psychologist. So where do I come into this field? I'll be talking about, as you mentioned in the introduction, the effects of urbanization on mental health, the effects there are on having green spaces, green lungs within an urban space, and also can link this up to the use of sports within a nation, within a densely populated country, and its importance or its role for linking that to the mental health of the nation. I work with children's services, with the mental health services in Malta. I'm also the clinical lead for a private, the first multidisciplinary team set up on the island, TAASC. So that is a mental health service, and also the lead for Move, which is a service which offers sports psychology for both young people and adults. And in fact, one of our aims is lifestyle changes with the people who we work with. Also, apart from that, I mentioned the academic part. My area of expertise is working with young people who are hard to reach with complex mental disorders, but also I've done research in the area of sports and also in neurodevelopmental disorders, mainly ADHD and autism. Thank you.
An impressive portfolio. All three of you, well, thank you for making the time to join us this evening. My first question, now after hearing these experiences that you've brought to the table, is whether there are some very specific urban factors that contribute or not to mental health. So whether really, we're speaking of green open spaces, we're speaking of good urban design. Can you bring to the table from your experience some specific factors in the built environment that we can kickstart the discussion with? I don't know whether I think, Alexia, would you like to start this, and then we can bring in other perspectives.
I think I'd start right. The thing is, we always talk about, well, we like to talk about green open spaces and possibly the lack of them, but we need to be talking about the urban environment in general, and which factors in the urban environment are already acting as stressors, if you will. Research shows us that, for example, in the UK, for example, research shows us that usually places on the edge, so places which are not the city center where there's a lot happening, it's more organized and so on, but usually places on the edges or on the periphery are the ones that kind of lead to a poorer crop of neurons, if you want, or people having more issues with disorders which can be made worse, if you want, by the urban environment. And because we are wired differently, these effects are usually manifested more in males than in females, in young males than in females, when we have a responsiveness from the environment. And usually there are areas where we have a lot of confusion, a lot of mixed messages, where it is not always clear to get from an area to another, and so on. And although in Malta we like to think that we don't have these peripheries, we actually have these types of spaces, and quite a few of them, where it is unclear to understand, for example, for one to understand what a place means, what it signifies, what a facade hides behind it, for example. Sometimes even simpler things like how to get from one side to another, how to cross, and so on. And with all these mixed messages, especially with the rise of this, all the advertising, all the messages, all those messages in your face. So when you're already at a state where you're a bit more stressed, having all that input of information is going to be even more stressful to manage. So looking at it from that point of view really simplifies the identification of stressors, really. Ultimately, we're managing information around us. The environment is giving us information. When that information is messed up, if you want, or not clear, it's a bit like having a desktop, which is a mess, and you have to find a file. It's that you have a task, you need to get from a place to another, you need to fulfill a task, and there's so much coming at you at the same time that's difficult to manage. And that in itself becomes stressful. It can be stressful for any average person, and it is even more so for someone who is already experiencing stress from other sources and then has to manage that on top of everything else.
Yes, it's like being overtired, and then something comes in, and suddenly on top of that overtiredness, you're dealing with other things. So it's an interesting aspect. This is an aspect of almost clutter, no? The
Yes,
cluttered built environment.
It's urban clutter, ultimately. Urban clutter,
That's
which is
it.
disorganized because there isn't an overarching system which controls the extent to which objects or items are added. We tend to look at them piecemeal, each one on its own. But it's really important to understand a stretch or an area as a whole, because that is ultimately what the person is experiencing when walking in the street.
Yes, yes. In fact, walkability was the one thing that came to mind. You know, when sometimes you're walking down the street, it's very clear, you know, it's very safe. You feel very, you know what you should be doing in that space. Odette, would you like to pick up this theme in relation to infrastructure before I move on to Nigel to speak about specific mental health issues which are related to, I'm going to continue with this concept of clutter for the time being.
Yes, Wendy, and I'll touch upon what you mentioned last about walkability. So again, given my background, normally we look at the public space out there, and we try to maximize the way in which we subdivide the space for the various users. And obviously experience has shown us that over the past years, I think it's very evident, we've been given priority to vehicles rather than to people. And what I always preach, sometimes, you know, starting with my student, is that the moment we go out from our houses, we're all pedestrians. So the importance of thinking how I'm going to go, like Alexia mentioned, from point A to point B, and how easy is that for me to do so. And not just starting from an able-bodied, if I have to say so, adult, but looking also from the eyes of a child, the eyes of a mother, the eyes of a person who needs to use a wheelchair. And for example, starting with the immediate stressors that you meet on the footpath, you know, such things as you know, poles, signs, etc. So the moment you start walking, so you get out from the door, from your house, and you start walking, you need to start to negotiate, you know, situations which can prove to be stressful. Not just, for example, for the person who cannot walk on the footpath but needs to, but for example, for you know, we as parents to allow our children to walk safely, for example, to schools. So I think there is a lot when we speak about mobility. If we start from safety of walking from point A to point B, then we go to dedicating space for all the various road users, if it is walking, cycling, public transport users, and how much they feel safe or lack of safety when they're crossing a road, for example, etc. And then when it comes to design, we go into designing for the movement of vehicles, ideally outside our urban areas. So we look at efficiency of speed, etc. But, you know, creating that sense of space within urban areas where people feel safe to move around, not just to drive around, but to move around in urban areas.
And are there, Nigel, could you maybe describe some specific mental health issues, just to, you know, let us familiarize ourselves with, I mean, I am a built environment professional, so I'm aware, or, you know, of the rudiments of what Alexia and Odette are speaking about, but I'm not aware, and maybe our audience is not aware of specific mental health issues linked to this issue of there not being clarity in public space.
Okay, so where I would come in is, so we were mentioning structure and the importance of structure and noise, but I would like to start from the very, I mean, kind of the evolutionary concept. Okay, so organisms, when they're living in a healthy environment, can thrive. Any organism living in an environment which is not appropriate for it is known to suffer physically and also when it comes to mental health. So we know that the risks or the prevalence of mental health is much higher in urban cities, okay, as opposed to rural areas. And we know that the crime rate is higher in cities, aggression is higher, and also research might say it is debatable that also ADHD is also higher in cities as opposed to rural areas. However, there is a link, as you mentioned in the very beginning, a specific direct link to depression and anxiety, and which I think is important to be aware of, is that why is a green lung important within a city? Because I mean we're not going to change the limitations of our island, or is that every organism or every bit of nature, okay, evokes a sensation within us, and every sensation evokes an emotional response. So I think it is starting from there. Okay, if I'm making sense, and then that moves on to what you touched upon the beginning, what Alexia is mentioning, structure and the importance of structure, and linking that to being triggered within an environment, sensations, noises. So I think just as a kind of introduction is that when someone is living in a very urban area, we're constantly living, and I will explain maybe later on, in a state of fight or flight, a slight state of fight or flight, which we tend to call stress. Okay, and what I found interesting is that I think if I had to link it that specifically to Malta, over this weekend I was abroad with a few friends who were racing, and we're all from different backgrounds. It was a conversation we were having, which was interesting, was how one person mentioned how we all seem, it's not called Mercieca, Malta, when we go around the island. And possibly the reason is that this is the sense of fight or flight. This is how you explain what fight or flight is. All right. And the comment was how calm these people seem in this country. They seem calmer than us. Kind of, it was Monday afternoon. And they seemed like it was a city, but it wasn't. It wasn't as though you're going down around London or go around somewhere in Malta, which is a much more busier urban area. That's
Can we maybe link this to, now let's start speaking of green open spaces specifically. I'm sure that there is a link, but maybe someone can pick up the baton and explain this link of you know, less stresses related to a greener environment.
Definitely. I mean, there's lots of research which shows us that green spaces allow for better living, allow for more well-being, but unfortunately we're kind of misusing the word well-being now, or we're using it too often, so we're taking it for granted. I find it's like the new buzzword following sustainable. Now we're off that, And now we're all excited to be talking about well-being. But the thing is, we are all aware of this. Just to quote, if you may be aware of the Youth Mental Health Barometer, which was commissioned by Richmond Foundation for the year 2021, so just coming out of or in the peak of COVID, when they had collected information to try and understand how youth are feeling. And in the questions related to the environment, that was one of the main things, that they would seek green spaces. And what I found really interesting is that they will seek quiet. When they were asked to point out the 3 things which they would look for most in the environment, and they had a selection of options to choose from, it was definitely generally green, open, and quiet. And I think quiet was really important, because we generally tend to associate youth with wanting noise and wanting a lot happening around them and so on. But the fact that at least a third of them referred to quiet as the most important, and even more of them amongst their top 3, shows you that even they are really craving that. Although we tend to think of them as always being online and always being switched on and everything, but it shows you that this sensitivity to their need, them expressing their needs as well, that they're after quiet and green as well. And on similar lines, I had a student last year who, for her dissertation, was looking at what youth, where youth would go to distress or to calm down in response to this what Nigel is saying, that there's always something happening, and their answers were that if they're outside the house, it would generally be the beach. So again, it's nature in general. I don't like to think of green, but nature in general. And in Malta, we have access to beaches everywhere. So it's the sea, which they find very calming. And at home, it's their own bedroom. Because some of them feel that in their bedroom, they actually get this solace, because otherwise in the house, again, there's noise and there are other people and there are always things happening. So those are the places they usually return to find calm. And I thought the beach was quite interesting, because it opens up the discussion to nature in general and not just green spaces.
It seems to me that the environment of the bedroom within 4 walls and the openness of the beach are direct opposites, but there must be a link there. It's very interesting. I mean, we know that the soothing sounds of the sea speaks to something very primitive inside us, no? But yes, it's opposite ends of the spatial spectrum, if you like. I don't know, would anyone like to pick this up and maybe take it forward? Maybe we could move the discussion into what can be done in Malta. Were are there any spaces which respond to this need for quiet? Maybe this need for being retrospective and introspective, and looking at sort of the more local scene.
Yes, Wendy, with this regard, as Alexia was mentioning, most of the time when we think about, places where we can relax, etc., we think of places, away from the urban area. So we look at rural areas, the beach, etc. However, I think what we are discussing here today is, can we create, public open spaces in urban areas where people, if they want to relax and maybe even find quiet spaces, they don't necessarily need to go out of their town. And obviously that is, for example, where we speak about accessibility. So how accessible are spaces where you can find, quiet spaces where you can spend some time relaxing or maybe carrying out certain activities. And here I refer to what Nigel was saying, maybe some sports activities which do not necessarily need to be the highly active ones. I myself, I practice yoga, so we do look up for spaces, outside spaces, both at the beach, but also in public gardens, for example, where we try to find quiet spaces to do so. And sometimes it is a challenge, because the way in which the traditional public open spaces are designed, we do not find maybe most of the places, those secluded areas where you can be in peace and quiet, because most of the time you'll hear the buzzing noise, for example, of traffic, other uses which generate noise around you, etc. So that is something I wanted to touch upon, the ability to create spaces within urban areas where you actually can create quiet spaces maybe using, you know, buffers, etc., to close off, you know, all that noise and maybe distraction of whatever is happening around us.
Sometimes I get the impression that we feel that we're always on. Now Nigel referred to this, but it's like, although there are so many people on this very densely populated island, because we are proximate communities and many people know each other, it's hard to lose oneself. So you would expect to be able to almost lose yourself in the crowd, but you don't, do you? Because you feel like you're always, well, not performing, but you are, you know, in society, and you have a role to play in that society, and space contributes to that. Nigel, would you like to pick up the discussion here and bring all these themes together in terms of not finding that headspace, that quiet space that we need to function properly? I don't know if I'm getting this right, because as I had said, I'm not sure where this discussion leads to. As an introvert myself, I know that I need my quiet space. Is this the case for everyone, or isn't it so?
Yes, I think everybody needs their quiet space in their own way. So I guess, I mean, we're talking about sensory input here. So this is my understanding. So the sensory input is so it's noise, it's colors, it's light. And as we mentioned before, all this gives pollution, dust. So all this gives rise to, it evokes emotions. Okay. And then there is the concept, which I think Alexia mentioned in the beginning, I touched on the concept of being structured. So a structured place. So let's start off from structure. So if I know that I can leave from point A, from my house to point B, and get to work within 15 minutes every day, then that will enable me to be quite, that would reduce my level of fight or flight, my level of anxiety of being late for work or late for wherever I'm going. If my travel time will vary between 15 minutes to an hour because of traffic, because there is lack of structure on the island, that is going to evoke a certain amount of anxiety, because we all know that you're late, and then there is a backlog of things you have missed out on. The same applies to, for example, if you are coming home from work and you anticipate that you're going to find parking where you live. Okay, or where you go to work, there are parking spaces. If there aren't parking spaces, there is the stress of being later, there is the stress of being fined, and there are a number of other stresses which all add up. So then the sense of structure. I mean, you all work at university, and I'm not sure as an institution kind of the level of structure there is, but we all work in different areas. But what I do remember is that where I worked, I worked for 7 years in the UK, and most time, if I had to apply for something, whether it was work related or even for my house, if I had to apply for the internet cable, they would tell me, yes, we'll come and fix your cable within 3 weeks. And within 3 weeks they come, and there is structure. If the same thing is happening, if you would like to apply for a job in Malta, there's a chance that you get an answer within a day, or a chance that you get an answer within 6 months, or you never get an answer. So all this lack of structure gives rise to this feeling of anxiety. Okay, because I'm not sure whether the person is going to turn up. I'm not sure whether this is going to happen. So that is structure. If we add to that, the sense of constant, so you mentioned the sensory input. So then there is the sense of, so we've got sunlight. We know that sunlight is an antidepressant. Okay, so, and there are positives to that. You mentioned blue spaces. We've got a lot of sea. Okay, and the small proximity of the island. So there are positives. And I think we need to look at that. So a number of people who do move to Malta really enjoy Malta because they can do 5-10 things in one day. And I can say the same thing. If I went to live in London, I would enjoy it because it's fun for a few years. You can do so many things in one day, and there's everything around you. The question is, do you want that for the rest of your life? Okay, so it's good to be able to do 10 things, but you can't do 10 things if you're living in a more rural area in the UK or somewhere in another place, because it takes you an hour to travel to work, an hour to travel to a sports place, an hour to travel to your relatives. So you do a lot less. So there are pluses and minuses. But the thing is, if you're constantly switched on sensorily, then there are repercussions when it comes to one's mental health. And I think that is one of the main things. So, I mean, if we have to look at the biology of it, it's the limbic system which is constantly switched on in a sense of fight, okay, or flight. So the minute you walk on the street, you said you become a pedestrian. If the street is not safe, that is going to affect how you feel. And just my last point on this topic is that apart from what we have in the real world, there is the virtual world, which is present for all of us. But social media, once again, has its positives and also has its negatives. And if you feel that you're constantly switched on, bombarded with notifications, as you might be hearing on my computer, so notifications are constantly coming in, that is also another sensory input, which is also going to have an increase in our levels of stress on a day-to-day level. And especially, so you talked about safe space in your room in Malta, but if your room can't be a safe space because you are being bombarded with media, social media, or even online bullying in young people, or comments, even positive comments or negative comments, those all have an effect on, so it's dopamine stimulation to the brain, but it's further stimulation, which will, for example, affect the way you sleep at night. So everything, so I think it's important to think about the fact that everything has an effect on us, and we have an effect on everyone within an environment. We don't live in isolation. But I'll stop there because I went on a
no, but you're inspiring me to ask whether it is the simple availability of green spaces or how we use them. So are we able to, utilize the green and blue spaces that we have? No, we have the sea, we have valleys, we do have them, but maybe in a way where we actually maximize their benefits. You mentioned, yes, virtual. So like when you're in an open space, you focus on interacting with friends. Maybe you switch off some technology, or maybe like Odette mentioned, you do some yoga. Is it a question of how we use them, and whether people really need to really be educated about how to use them to benefit their mental health? Because often it might be the case, and this is where I'd like to open up the discussion, in that we are not aware of how to live healthier in terms of mental health.
I'm not sure I don't know here if you're asking someone specific.
No, it's general. No,
I'm not sure we need to be educated though, because if the space is empathetic, if the space is enabling, it will come natural. So I don't think we need to learn how to live well. We need to learn how to design for the people to live well, and that is the problem I find when I was referring to structure. I mean, it goes back to very basic things, like if you're in a space, understanding Lynch is very basics, which really apply to mental health. There are nodes, landmarks, and paths. If my path leads to nowhere, if I cannot read where the important parts are, like the nodes and the landmarks, it's very difficult for me to locate myself. Like a very natural thing we do is I always know where I am in time and space. And to be able to do that, I have to be able to read my surroundings, because my surroundings afford the way I understand where I am, obviously, and sun, to understand time. And that's why I study people with dementia. These are the things which we don't find with people with dementia, which they start struggling with. Which is why, for example, natural light becomes very important, because they start losing their orientation. We see they start staying up at night and so on and so forth. We tend to say that, for example, people with dementia get lost. In reality, it's not because they're getting lost. It's because they don't understand their surroundings anymore, because their surroundings aren't doing them justice in a way, because that is one of the few things which we can still see through the dementia. But if I really can't take it when we say the person is aggressive, for example, or for example, when we have children with ADHD or children with autism, we say, because they're becoming really aggressive, or because it's the way they're reacting and so on. It is not just the diagnosis, it is the diagnosis and the environment. And the environment is obviously the physical environment and the social one as well. So when I hear people saying, because that person with dementia is aggressive, it is not the person who is aggressive. I think it's the person as a result of what the environment is giving them. Because as average human beings, because I don't like to use the word normal, our brain allows us to adjust what we're seeing around us. So we have this adjusting mechanism, I don't want to go into the technicalities, which allows us to kind of, if something isn't doing us good in the environment, we can switch, we can get up and leave, for example, because we can manage that. Whereas, for example, people with dementia and some people with other mental health problems, that area in the brain, when dementia, we lose it completely. And in some other mental health problems, it is affected. So rather than being able to say, I'm not happy here, I'm going to get up and leave, I'm going to manifest it behaviorally in another way. I can be aggressive, I can start swearing at people, I cannot be nice to people, and so on. But it is not, as I was saying, just the disease, it is the way I'm reacting to my surroundings. I could be, for example, overstimulated by the sound or by the light. And rather than being able to say, like any average human being, I'm not comfortable, I'm going to get up and move, or I'm going to lower the volume, I'm going to lash out in another way, and it's going to be behavioral. So then automatically I'm labeled as having X. And this is what we need to understand. It's this, and sometimes it's in children as well, because children haven't yet developed the ability to say, I am not happy here, or I'm not comfortable. And we start saying they're hyper. I hate hearing the fact they're hyper. But what do you expect if they're constantly stimulated by media and with children? We tend to, for example, this is one of the examples I like to use with my students. Like with childcare is when we think that children are excited by primary colors. In reality, we're overstimulating them. We're not doing them any justice. Neutral colors actually work better for children, like they work for us. But we tend to think traditionally that they like red, green, blue, yellow. The more we put in, the better. We're actually overstimulating them. So then when they come home, they need that period. When they leave the school or wherever it is they're being educated, they need that period to actually kind of detox, come down again, calm down. Otherwise, to actually hit that level of stimulation, you have to excite them even more by something even more stimulating. In the same way with media, really. When we say they're always online, then to get them excited again, I have to give them something which stimulates them more. Same thing with the environment. If the environment is constantly overstimulating or constantly giving me too many messages, then I have to first learn how to deal with it. And with a child, they're still learning that. And then we find that with elderly and people with dementia, we need to make up for it because the brain is no longer managing that function. And then they have to give them spaces which help them kind of make up for it. So to reach that balance again. And because we're not all able to reach that balance on our own, we have to obviously design an environment which allows us, which meets the needs we have for balance, calm, tranquility, for leading an average life, really.
You're placing the responsibility, if you like, on the designer here, and it's relevant to this webinar because at Dawra Madwarna we try to advocate for this. You know, any professional, not necessarily related to the built environment, but as designers, you know.
Because we tend to refer to people with a disability or people who are more vulnerable as because they have that, so that is it. But it is their behavior isn't just them, it's them plus the environment. It's a result of both of them. I've carried out research with a lot of people with dementia in very different environments, specifically to understand which work better. And similar diagnoses don't always result in the same behavior because, for example, people who are exposed to a garden or to natural light without them needing to make that difference physically are generally happier. And there is a happiness index we use, there's a well-being index we use to measure it, and they're generally calmer. So automatically also requiring less medication. And we're talking about very similar diagnoses, but because they're living in different environments, their lifestyle is different, their outcome is different, and their well-being is different. And this is the same for everyone, really, because it happens to the rest of us. We tend to get through a day when we get to the day and we say in the evening, I'm really tired today, without realizing that it's because we had to manage the environment. The environment was so complex. We had so many things to manage besides the rest of the day, obviously. That it for us, it's tiredness. We don't like display aggressive behavior, but we feel it that way anyway.
We do sometimes display aggressive behavior. I suppose a lot of the road rage between 5 and 7.
If I can jump in there, I mean, I fully agree with Alexia. So I think this is important. So when we mentioned, I think there was a study which came out, and then it provoked a response in the time, a newspaper article. But Maltese tend to be angrier than one of the highest rates of anger in Europe. I think Alexia explained the reason very well. So there's always a biosocial model, okay, a biosocial reason. That you can biologically be innately born to be more aggressive, but probably it's not that Maltese are born to be more aggressive. Probably we have the equal amount of aggressive Maltese as there are in the rest of the world, if we had to measure that. But it is the environment that makes a difference, and it's the environment that we can control. But at the end of the day, we can control the controllables. So yes, if there is less levels of stimulation because of the way our buildings are built or our institutions are built, the colors used, what's given to our children, of course it makes a difference. But then again, there is also an element of things that we can change, the spaces or areas around us. So if I am innately, as you mentioned, a child who's described as being hyperactive, then having the open space to go out, and there's my sitting tolerance at school, where schools expect us to sit down, is going to be a lot better. Okay, so I think, and we can make changes there. So I'm not sure whether, I don't think it's been mentioned, but I mean, the concept of rechanging certain our inner city, what is the inner city area, or you can explain this more. So maybe it's the village squares. So if those could be pedestrianized, I do believe it does happen in Italy, in every village square in the weekend, and it becomes pedestrianized, and people go out and walk around, and that makes a big difference. We can walk safely around. I'm not sure it does happen much. It doesn't happen in any villages in Malta. There's been talks of it. I know that sometimes on some Sundays there is one local council which blocks off a road for cyclists to go and cycle, which is excellent. So you can go and cycle without the risk of being hit by a car for a certain number of hours. But these are small initiatives that would make a difference, I think, to our young people, but also older people and everybody on the island. I think Sarah asked a question. Since
Sarah asked,
can I answer that?
Yes, please. And then I'll bring in Odette to speak about some new projects that are responding to these trends.
All right, I guess, I mean, if she's specifically asking about mental health trends between urban and rural areas, so there are loads internationally, but we had done one study particularly quite a few years ago, and that was about 2010, when we looked at the incidence of psychosis in Malta, and we looked at localities. And what we found were, if I remember rightly, that the western part of the island had the lower rate of psychosis, and so had Gozo at the time. This was 2010, I think, we published. So the work was done about 2008. So yes, there are some studies. I know Dr. Sacco is doing a study on children and young people at the moment, so we'll get a lot more information on mental disorders in relation to localities. But I don't believe Malta is any different to other countries. However, with the dense population of Malta, it just feels that now we are just almost one. We behave as one city. So I doubt we're going to have many changes, because even Gozo has probably changed in the last 10, 15 years, quite a lot when it comes to how urban it is. However, if you do, I mean, the minute you cross the ferry and go over, it's immediately quieter. And personally, I feel, this is not scientific research, but I feel a sense of relaxation when I just go across. So there must be something a bit different.
There's this process of transition, no? A friend of mine has a lovely analogy. Whenever we go out for a coffee, he says, no, first remove the stack of books that's on your head, just let it go, and then we'll have our chat. So we carry so much load, don't we? And it just becomes part of whom we are. But I would like to bring the discussion, Odette, I would like to ask you specifically, in the projects that you have in your practice, are you seeing a shift towards a more awareness of mental health and designing for positive mental health? Is this something that is
yes, Wendy, and I would like to join this also with what Nigel was mentioning. For example, creating, spaces in our piazzas, etc., where it is safe to walk. He mentioned the example of the Booch. From my end, I hope to see more, not on a temporary basis, but on a permanent basis. And basically here, I think we need to mention that at least, let's say, there is a process where we have started admitting that we have given too much attention to spaces for parked vehicles, certain high speeds within our town centers. And we are rethinking this. So for example, if we take the spaces around schools, I think those would be, good examples to start with, So how safe is it to take your children on foot to school? And that would change, our mobility behavior. And obviously, this links again to what Nigel was mentioning before, that we tend to be, all buzzed up and we want to do 10 things in a day. And for example, if we think that I have, young children, they are still at primary school age. So if I think that I would need to walk from home to school to get them there, because roads around and streets around the school would be, closed off to traffic, then that will not maybe take me the 5 minutes it take me today to go with the car, drop off the girl, and then go to my workplace. So that will probably take me a bit longer. Maybe that will take me, instead of 5 minutes, it will maybe take me 20 minutes. So if that is the case, when I drop her off in the morning, and the same thing, pick her up. So most probably, instead of doing 10 things in a day, maybe I'll be doing 9 things in a day. But it doesn't necessarily mean that it's a bad thing. It is more adjusting our behavior. And I think in order for such projects, so there are a number of local councils which are trying to come up with projects which pedestrianize areas around church, around school, etc. Obviously, we need a change in behavior, because we find a lot of resistance from people who do not want to park their car maybe 5 minutes away and free up the space in that area for more landscaping, for more space for children to play around, for more space for some catering establishments to have those small tables where someone can take a coffee without having all the cars buzzing by, and where young youths can share what they're seeing maybe on their mobiles, etc., in a safe space. So yes, we are seeing a trend on wanting to go there. The challenges, I think, is that in order to do so, there must be a change in mentality and a change in behavior of people, especially living in that area, which is going to be pedestrianized, etc. But also, for example, people who have some relation with that area. So if, for example, taking your children to school, on foot, and with no need to go there with the car and drop them off, just behind the school door.
Is it a question of multidisciplinarity? Are we somehow, as built environment professionals, not working with the right people, or not working with people who can tell us a bit more about, what people need from space? I mean, my subject specifically is participation and social impact. So I'm aware of the benefits of working with people, stakeholders, if you like to call them that, themselves. But here at Dawra Madwarna, we do try to build a network of professionals who know each other and therefore can call upon each other. Alexia, maybe I can bring you in here. Is there scope for just widening the scope of this professional network to achieve better spaces, better quality in urban space?
Yes, definitely. I myself work with, from a research point of view and even from a practice point of view, with a lot of different professionals. I've worked with Nigel as well. So definitely there is scope, but what I find is that some people are less likely to be interested in asking for help, because it's like you're giving up your project there's a bit of that, you know. Unfortunately, the name Perit traditionally signifies, you know, absolutely everything, but we know that you need to be able to consult with different people and to accept different points of view, especially people who are more versed in that area. It's absolutely normal. So even professionally, for example, I tend to step into projects a lot as consultant specifically on this area. So the project would actually be of a colleague or of a firm who has the commission, and then I step in on a specific area. So how do we make the space more enabling for the users, depending on the specific users? Generally, they're more vulnerable users because that's the area I work in. But how it is more responsive to the needs of the users they're working with. And we work very well together. There are never any issues of overstepping. It's a learning curve for both of us. So I guess it's a change in mentality as well. But as Odette is saying, there's a general public which we have to deal with. I mean, recently in my own community, I was quite impressed that they're on a mission to widen pavements, to make it more walkable and to create more spaces to play, and the public is complaining. The public has taken to Facebook complaining that they're killing the center because people cannot stop their car right outside the shop they need to get something from. So that's why I think it is essential. It is going to be a long process, and we have to start from schools and from children, and we need to I'd take it a step further to what Odette was saying, not just the walk to school, but actually the school has to be designed. I mean, I feel pain when I see new schools coming up, which are completely tarmacked and there isn't even a tree. So a kid cannot even practice yoga because some schools are finally doing this and doing meditation in early years. But where are they going to do it? I mean, the best place to do it is under a tree. The best place to do it is in the soil and to feel it. I mean, this week at university, I was discussing one of my students at master's level is working on a horticultural project. They're challenged when you ask them where a carrot grows and where a potato grows and whether it's in the soil or above ground. And I find that quite stressful for someone in their early 20s. And these things should be happening at school, I think, because if I live in a relatively contained apartment, I'm on the van, I'm whisked to school. At school, I'm never in touch with a tree. And then I go to private lessons or whatever it is, any activity. And if it's not sports, it's worse because I'm stuck inside. And I go back home. If these kids aren't taken to a green space, or if they don't have one in their immediate vicinity, they're not exposed to it. Yeah. It's like, you know, touching soil. I'm getting dirty, it's uncomfortable and everything. Whereas these things have to be integrated in their education from a young age. So we need to start from changing the schools if we want to change the way. I think with the older generations, we've already lost it, and it's going to be very challenging. So if we're really going to make change, you have to start from the younger ones.
Yes, having a young child myself, I can definitely see how that is the way to change the system, because they soak up, they socialize themselves through their environment. I would like to ask our audience whether there are any questions you would like to have, any comments you would like to make. This is the time when we usually give you the floor. So please do pop in with a comment or a question. There has been a lot said in relation to how we can contribute, or at least what we expect. So it would be lovely if we could hear from you.
Maybe I can ask a question as well, Wendy, because I've just been listening to this until maybe other people come in. Feel free to raise your hands if you're unsure how to, you know, or even just put a question in the chat. I wanted to go back, so I was quite interested in the whole discussion because I tend to focus a lot on this idea of green spaces, obviously. So the green, which Alexia was saying, it's not just the green. And actually that's, you know, I found that really interesting to think of actually what are all the other, you know, triggers. And Nigel was going on about actually how even just the way we work as a society when things don't function, and actually we have to, you know, we don't plan, and the lack of planning then actually creates those, you know, stress responses. So obviously there are certain things like that, the lack of organizational structure, which possibly we cannot change as built environment professionals. But does this aspect of green and nature really act as I think you mentioned, Nigel, you said you started off with this idea of the organism and sort of how, and nature, and how that sort of gives some sort of emotional response in us as human beings. So if we really try and inject more of this possibly green or nature or quiet time or you know, spaces, sense of refuge. This is actually something which came out even in my own research when I asked people what they miss from public spaces. And you're right, Alexia, it was exactly this, a place for a sense of refuge, a place to get away from it all. So if we had these green lungs, or not even necessarily green lungs, even just some more you know, trees in our streets, is it something which can really counterbalance the fact that, yes, we live in a very dense island, and yes, maybe certain things organizationally as a society don't always go as planned, and we have to, you know, always as if we're playing catch up. Can it contribute to our mental health, not even necessarily just, you know, diagnose mental health issues and anyone's mental health?
I mean, if I had to answer that, so I think there's a lot of research to support the difference between living in a very urban and very busy environment and living in a rural place. So I think that is a fact. Both physical health and mental health. So increased blood pressure, increased heart disease, increased gastric stomach ulcers. So there is a direct link between living in a having a very stressful life, a busy life, as opposed to living in a quieter area. But I think if we had to turn this a bit personal, even if we think of ourselves, if we have to drive on the weekend or go somewhere on the weekend and there is more space, just let's say Maestral Park, you actually do feel better. So this is I guess the way we feel and the way we live. So it's a personal experience. So yes, you might find a few people who say, look, I mean, I've met people, I love living in London, I love the fact it's constantly on the go. But as I mentioned, I think earlier on, which couldn't have been more practical, is that, okay, we were 4 people abroad this weekend, okay, in a city, in a different country. We went for sports, but we're all from different parts of Malta and different backgrounds. We all said that it is a lot more peaceful and a lot more comfortable being here as opposed to Malta. So a lot of people mentioned there's less. So these people mentioned there's less dust, there were less cranes, there's less noise. I think it makes a difference.
Mm-hmm. So there are, you know, these very specific stresses in the environment. It's something that we are lobbying for now, even as Dawra Madwarna. I think the position paper really makes a case for just being outside in green, open spaces. I know our audience probably follows us, but you know that we do piazza picnics, and we try to find a range of spaces to be, because at times we found that it's very much about challenging the use of space. Almost embarrassed to put down a picnic blanket and open, I don't know, a container of sandwiches and just sit down and let the kids play and join in and so on. We've had an instance, I'll never forget this, but we had a piazza picnic in Ġdien La Parelli in the Valletta ditch, and we had people taking photos of us. So it was something for them, you know, worthy of taking a photo of these strange people doing this strange thing when all we were doing is just letting the kids run riot, and we were enjoying a chat, you know, just enjoying being in the space. And this is a very urban space we're speaking of, so we're not speaking of Maestral Park here. It is just a very urban space that we're challenging the use of. I see a question from Faye. So Faye has written here, I think one way to change the public's reaction to change is to change the focus. People focus on what they are losing instead on what they are gaining by the change. So I feel that the role of placemaking can help to highlight the gains. Now, let's bring, thank you, Faye, for that prompt. Let's bring placemaking into this discussion. Placemaking. Odette, I know that we've spoken about this concept before. Is it something, I mean, we know that it's something that you can design for. We know that an environment can be responsive to our needs through theories of placemaking. How can we change the mentality? So we said that people respond to their environment. Yes, so how can we design an environment now, specific design considerations to change that mindset and to change the response?
I think we mentioned this before, for example, how important it is to introduce, these concepts even with children in schools. And I think that is something which we've been discussing as colleagues, etc. But even, these workshops that can be done with children to get these ideas from a very young age on what can be done to change the environment in which we live, in which we compute, in which we learn, etc. So I think I believe a lot in bringing up these ideas from a very young age, not just in terms of design, but also to learn about the aspirations of young children, and maybe sometimes even of their families, etc., and transform those needs, those aspirations into the design through obviously placemaking, etc.
In fact, placemaking does exactly this. No, you link people and design, and you consider people as designers almost. So we test initiatives. It's a lot about testing. It's a lot about tactical urbanism. It's a lot about trying things and seeing whether they work, and then if they work, you consolidate the initiative and you take it forward. But you give it time to become familiar, and you give it time to become to elicit. I suppose now I'm understanding it differently after this webinar. You give it time to elicit the response that contributes to good mental health. Nigel, is there a reason that we can explain behind this? How can having these small interventions, temporary interventions, just giving them time to become familiar, why is this successful, do you think?
Okay, I think so there is, a little bit of stress brings on resilience, so it does help. A lot of stress is toxic and makes us all tired. Okay, so going to work is low stress, but that does help. It does help in the long run, helps us become more resilient individuals. But there is also, the balance is also important. So there is also an element of needing time to just be, as was mentioned in the very beginning. And we also know that, so there is the biological aspect. So having your neurotransmitters, having your brain chemicals constantly firing in response to signals is exciting, is fun, but is exhausting in the long run. Okay, so there are times when the brain, and that is why all humans need to sleep. So biologically, although some people say I can almost do away with sleep, biologically we know that it leads to brain damage if you don't sleep a certain amount of hours per night. Okay, cognitively there is a cognitive decline, so in one's intelligence, if you have years of not sleeping. Okay, so in a way our bodies are programmed to kind of need time to recharge and need time for less stimulus. That in itself leads to good mental well-being. So okay, we use the word mental well-being, but WHO recommend 5 main things, and that one is, as we said, a good amount of sleep, good amount of nutrition, having a healthy environment, having good social contact, regular exercise, and giving something back to the society. So that is what WHO recommend. All the things I've mentioned, none of them include achievements, none of them include basically achieving in life, rushing in life. Okay, they are all 5 basic needs which help reduce and help ground us and reset, which is, I think, something that we do need. I think that is mainly the understanding, because when we are triggered positively, all right, you did increase. So if I am triggered positively through work, if I'm excited through work, there is motivation. Okay, but there's a release of endorphins. But how much can you remain triggered with the amount of endorphins? That leads to burnout. If I am triggered negatively, that leads to worry. Okay, but how often can I live in worry or in a state of unhappiness? So I think that is it. When we are out in a more neutral environment, you are away from these polarized responses, which is and it helps us reset as people.
Yes, I think I understand that. You give a change, you make a small change in order to trigger the right kind of stress. Nina, I see your hand raised.
Or trigger less. We do less.
Okay.
Sometimes it's better to do less in life. So less is more. This is where it applies.
Now you're speaking like an architect.
I've never heard architects say less is more. Architects generally do more is more. But okay. Okay, I'm not sure.
Later. Nina.
Hi. I think this topic about the refuge is a really good. I mean, that's a key statement, I think, because I think that's really also the problem in Malta, that a lot of the times, even your refuge, your home, isn't even really a refuge anymore, because you have construction on every side of your house. You have the noise and the traffic and the dust, and you feel even like sometimes when you want to just find a place where you have quiet and peace and quiet, you can't even find it in your own home. So I think like that's maybe also something that it's an interesting thing to think about, like how can we maybe create spaces outside your home, you know, that really give you this peace and quiet, not just, you know, yes, like what we're doing with the piazza picnics, we're picking like sometimes even in the most busiest areas we put down our blankets, but like on the opposite, how can you create a space that's really, you know, like maybe it's thick greenery, or like how can we create, like to think about really the design implications of creating a space like that really gives you this piece of, like, what does it mean, like how can you create it really on plan, you know, or in reality, like what does it need? I think that's really interesting to maybe look more into that kind of.
I'm not sure this would partly answer, but I mean, I think what we're looking at is, and there is initiative here, is a change, a bit of a cultural change. What I find very interesting is that with the minute we go abroad, we're all very flexible and we all adapt to whatever city we live in. And if that city requires using public transport or using a bicycle, people who are sedentary suddenly buy a bicycle and start using a bicycle most times. So I find that so as humans, we are adaptable. But as a culture, we have found this comfortable. I mean, you mentioned the architecting, and it struck a chord. I remember almost probably 40 years ago, in the car with my father, who's an architect. And I was asking him, so I must have been 5 years old or something like that, maybe a bit older, 5-10 years old. And I told him, why do I have all these cranes in Malta? This was almost 40 years ago. And all this noise and dust, okay? My area was being dropped down. And he said, but that is the future. Look at cities and urban, and we need to build these. He said, in 10 years' time, it will all be gone and we'll have the cities and things will be structured. 30 years later, or almost 40 years later, we probably have more cranes. So I think it's a culture. It hasn't changed. This has been going on for all my life, all our lives, I guess.
Yes, we tend to think of it as something contemporary, you know, something to deal with now.
Yes, we think it's now, and that our GDP is improving now and the economy is improving now. But I don't. I remember Slima falling and being rebuilt 30 years ago. It hasn't changed, though. So, I mean, this is where structure comes in. So where are we going? And I mean, I don't understand at all urban planning, but do we have any urban planning? I see there's a message on pavements, and I tend to run, but there's no way I run on a pavement in Malta. I run on a pavement abroad. If I run on a pavement in Malta, I'm sure I'll end up going to hospital because of an ankle sprain. And just end on one thing, I think maybe if there has to be a policy or a way of lobbying this, it may be looking at the effect of good physical and mental health urban planning has on reducing the expenditure of the health of the health department, basically, because I'm sure there is a direct correlation and link. So if we can reduce obesity by getting people to walk more, then I'm sure we spend almost $1 billion in health in our budget in Malta. This is a fact. That if you check the budget, it's almost $1 billion. So the Department of Health, I'm sure that would reduce by a significant amount if we have less people going in at a young age with heart disease, less people going in with road traffic accidents have doubled in the last years. I mean, I'm sure that is an expenditure, and those are costs on the nation.
And in fact, about studies, I participated recently in a study on obesogenic environments and how the environment is contributing to this epidemic. Sarah, did you want to say something? And then we can bring in the chat as well.
With that, if I may add, the more recent need, the more recent strain on mental health services. I personally work a lot with Richmond Foundation, for example, and that's what we're discussing recently. The spike they had, okay, there was COVID as well, but it hasn't subsided much on requests for help. So it's not, but the sad part is that when it's something we can quantify and see, like we're talking about obesity, so we can see it, we can quantify it, we can measure it. It's one thing. When we have mental health, although we have the increase in requests, it is still much harder for us to talk about it and to accept it. In fact, I'm saying that Dawn's comment may be similar to what I'm saying, that I think we're still not as comfortable speaking about it. For example, I speak a lot of people with dementia, people with mental health needs. I find myself not more comfortable speaking about it abroad, but when I speak in circles there, it's one thing and it's dealt with in one way. Here, we still struggle a lot, especially people who are affected. Like, for example, we struggle a lot to find participants in research when we have people with mental health problem, when we have people with dementia, because we still find a lot of, for example, carers who aren't as comfortable because it's harder to talk about it. So even from a research point of view, we struggle more here. I'm more likely to find participants in the UK, for example, than I am to find here, because we're still not as comfortable talking about, even if we're talking about the environment from it. So we're not specifically talking about the ailments of the person, but how the person deals with the environment, but still getting participants to come forward. For example, that talk to me privately, but then to come forward and participate, it's more challenging.
I'd like to bring in Raphael's comment here on whether he's saying sort of, I'm not sure whether it's helpful to highlight the social inequality that is manifest in unjust design, but perhaps it could be. So we haven't really gone into the ethics of design or really the social justice aspect of design. I think, Raphael, you've just inspired another webinar, but maybe in some closing comments for the last few minutes before we close off this session. Yes, let's do this. I'd like to ask you for some final comments, our three panelists. Can you relate this in any way to the ethics of this subject, to just design? Maybe Alexia, you can start off.
Yes, Wendy.
Or Odette, yes.
Sure.
So I was seeing this comment from Raphael. I think it is not done. You mentioned naivety, apathy, etc. I think we have this mentality. It's always been done like that. So why should it be different? So that is the way I see. Especially when we come to try and change, the way in which we design our public open spaces. And I've also been reading, research about this on these social inequality. For example, when it comes, if we think about mobility infrastructure, that is my area. So the way in which we cite certain projects. So I'll try to give a very quick example. So for example, having a major arterial road passing through an urban area and the effect it causes on the surrounding properties. For example, the need, we've been, in recent years started introducing, for example, noise barriers, because we know how stressful it is for people living in areas where you have, high speed moving traffic in that area. So I think we are becoming more maybe sensitive to this. However, I think there is much more to be done, even in, I'll take now the role of an academic, in educating our students about this. So it is not just, you know, designing, but thinking about the way in which design will affect you know, people not just using it, but, you know, for example, citing certain infrastructure in one place against another, what effect it can have on the, let's, you know, close off with comments specifically about this webinar. So the mental health well-being of users and affected people by those projects.
Alexia, your thoughts on how this topic can be linked to just design?
In fact, I was thinking about this when before Nigel was talking about the difference we find in research which relate to the numbers of people in urban areas as opposed to in more rural areas. But we also have research which shows us the same thing for people from lower income communities, that we cannot say urban areas in general, higher urban areas where we have a higher number of people from higher income, with a higher income background, obviously perform very differently to people from lower income background. And we see the same issues in the built environment and the surroundings and so on. I don't know if there is any study locally specific to income in terms of incidence of mental health problem or stress, but internationally I know it does exist. And this is a very real issue that unfortunately the money is spent in. We hear the comment, it's always in the same areas, but what about the other areas? Recently, I was working on a project in Bormla, where we're working for an NGO, and we had a community meeting. We organized a community meeting also to help with the NGO, because we had the residents are going to be women with mental health problems. So we wanted to kind of introduce, even on behalf of the NGO, the new users in the area as well, to kind of get feedback from the community. We had a very good turnout, and a lot of the feedback from the community was kind of, is there a catch? Why are you asking for our opinion? No one ever cared about what we think. And I thought that was very telling, that the community feels that they don't count or they don't matter as much. Their voice isn't as valuable as others. And actually we created a really good relationship with them. They've actually been very helpful with our site, because indirectly now they're keeping track and kind of telling on the contractors when they slack a little bit, and we get a call right away like, listen, he left this outside, or listen, he didn't close the door. So it created a really good relationship, just because we had them like on our side from the beginning, and they kind of claimed ownership of this new project as well, and they were willing to help. So there is the will, I think. It's just that we kind of have to break this hierarchy that as architects, we're up there, we know everything, we're going to tell everyone what to do. When we go into projects at the same level as the users and obviously adopt the bottom-up approach, it's much easier for all of us when we're learning from them as well. We're able to design for their needs more. So definitely having more equitable spaces is essential. And it goes back to the schools as well. We tend to find very big differences in schools in areas and in schools in others, which are generally areas of lower income as well.
In fact, what you're saying to me links very much with what Odette said in her closing remarks, in that it's it's a shift in mentality in giving agency, building social capital, and just allowing people to feel like they are a part of this. They are valuable. Yeah, that's nicely put. Nigel, some closing comments from you, please.
Yes, I'll build on what Alexia was saying. So it's the empowerment. I think if we're going to encourage a nation to change its ways and to recognize its importance, I don't think punitive measures work. So increasing the amount of wardens giving fines because of wrong parking or speeding tickets is not really going to stop road traffic accidents that keep happening. But I think empowering and educating is the way forward. So I liked the interesting response that they were from the community, where Alexia did the work, that the paranoid position as a psychiatrist, paranoid position of island mentality stood out so much. Why are you asking me? How are you going to stab me in the back? That probably encapsulates Maltese psychology, but okay. That's the island mentality. But what is interesting, I guess, moving forward, I think, look, if we think about it from a practical point of view, I mean, what are the main things which stuck out when we were younger? So I still remember the educational TV bits on Shumemo and not dirtying the island, and that was not because of fines, but I remember we used to throw things out as children, and suddenly we don't throw things on the floor. Same posted follow a wara of wearing a seatbelt and putting children at the back in the cars, and when we were younger would sit in the front. Now it's no longer allowed. That came, yes, you can say there were wardens out there and there were fines, but probably it is the education that helped. And I remember at school everybody used to quote the watching these cartoons. So possibly that is what would change your mentality. So genuinely putting more emphasis on the importance of being out in nature, the importance of sports. Is there any of that? I mean, yes, we're just talking between a few of us here, but how much do we genuinely push being out in nature, push to encourage people to be out? Are there incentives for people to cycle to work in Malta? Is there any mention of the small nations games taking place in Malta next week? Very little. It's sports. There's very little importance given to it. Thank you.
Well, thank you, everyone. I don't know, Sarah, whether you have some concluding comments to make. We work on this series of webinars together, Sarah and I, so it's very much a collaborative thing that we do.
I think, Wendy, actually, I did have one comment, and it was something which Nigel said, which really struck me when he was mentioning the 4 points that WHO sort of state as being important for mental health, for mental health. And I think, if I didn't get it wrong, Nigel, you said the last one was on the need to contribute to society, to do social good. I mean, this is something which we as Dawra Madwarna...
To give something back, yes.
To give something back to society.
Yeah.
Yes, and I didn't know that, you know, and obviously we've been thinking of the nature and the green, but as Dawra Madwarna, we are all people here. I mean, all of you here, even people who aren't directly part of the network, are actually trying to see how we can contribute and, you know, and improve things for the better. And to think that is actually something which instinctively helps everyone in society makes me think even more about what we are trying to do with placemaking. Because, you know, sometimes you mentioned, Nigel, the temporary closure of some streets for cycling or the temporary closure of piazzas for walking. And maybe sometimes as designers, when we see these activities and we say, oh, okay, it's just temporary, or, you know, if we just close a few streets and it's not this fantastic design that, you know, we are supposed to be doing as designers, you know, putting in the trees, putting them in properly, really thinking about the full, you know, all the set of design principles which we are supposed to, you know, do when we transform a public space or have a project. But if we just think it only in terms of actually getting people out into the streets to do something with their space and make them feel as if they are contributing to maybe transforming that space, even in a small way, or just being part of that change for the day, could be something which slowly triggers, well, a positive benefit for them and slowly triggers change. I don't know, that's something which, when you mentioned that, I thought, okay, actually this could be another added benefit, you know, of this placemaking activities. And so thank you for that, and maybe we can continue to take it forward in our events and activities and initiatives.
That was something that really struck me too. And maybe we can close off this webinar on a call. So please, if you come up with ideas for events and ideas for collaborations, do get in touch. There's our website. Many of you know us. So we're always trying to look for new ideas on how we can placemake and just be more present in the community and you know, just actively test out and forward the ideas that we speak about. But let's close off here for today. Thank you.
Wendy, Can I
Yeah.
just say, actually, there is that one event on the 4th of June. I use this as an advertising, which is being organized by the Floriana Local Council on the 4th of June, where they are actually trying to close some streets to do this. And okay, so I do it back
And
to
Dawra
Wendy.
Madwarna will be there in collaboration with many other people. So it's in the morning, isn't it? So from
Yes.
around 10 a.m. in the morning in Floriana, and yes, it's going to be a placemaking event, and I think one of the biggest of its kind that we've seen in Malta. So please do join us for some games and a picnic, of course. But thank you everyone for being here, and I do hope you join us for the next webinar in our series. Have a good evening. Bye.